My name's Karen Galway. Together with my colleague Sharon, I'll be presenting information from the Understanding Suicide study. The study has been funded by the Public Health Agency under the Protect Life Suicide Prevention Strategy for Northern Ireland. The primary investigator on the study is Professor Jerry Levy, Director of the Bamford Centre for Mental Health and Wellbeing at the University of Ulster. So some of the areas that we have focused on in this Understanding Suicide project have included geographical analysis of urban and rural patterns. We've looked at substance misuse. We've looked at issues around gender. And importantly, we've looked at the use of services, so primary care services and psychiatric services. But today, the focus of the presentation is bereavement. Okay, so we will address the Northern Irish specific context, recognising that the complexities of suicide are framed in time and place. I'll make a few brief salient points from the literature, but the main body of our presentation is insights gained from the empirical primary data that we have collected for the suicide study. And it's on these 4 categories of bereavement, relating to bereavement. So the rising rates in Northern Ireland of suicide have been cause for concern, and the upward trend is quite alarming. But the good news is that we are now benefiting from locally based knowledge that's coming out of research projects that have recently been published. For example, about community responses to suicide and about the experiences of people, young men who have attempted suicide. So that's useful because up to now, really the national and international literature has focused on a lot of medical and psychological approaches to research. So now we're getting this social information coming through, which is really useful. And Professor Mike Tomlinson, next slide, sorry. Professor Mike Tomlinson has who's one of the people to publish first on suicide in Northern Ireland in 2007. And he was here at a KES presentation in 2013 and made this point that it's really important that we exploit as much as possible the administrative data, as you've heard now in the previous presentation. So there's administrative data there we can use, but in order to really understand how social factors impact on the risk of suicide, we need to take other approaches too. So bereavement as a social issue has always been recognised as being related to risk of suicide. And bereavement after a suicide is known also to increase risk of future suicide. And terms like suicide contagion, suicide clusters, copycat suicide have been coined to describe this process. But the literature that's out there is a little limited really by methodological difficulties that surround looking at suicide. In 1969, we had an estimate come from a German suicide researcher called Schneidman that approximately 6 people will be deeply affected with grief after one suicide. But now, in more recent times, that assertion, which has been quoted again and again and again over the years, is under increased scrutiny. For example, last year in The Lancet, there was a study published that suggested that maybe up to 60 people would be affected by each individual suicide. And there are a number of reasons why we should be particularly concerned about this in Northern Ireland. Our population is small. Geographically, we are relatively static. People know people. The grapevine is strong, stories get around, and we're probably looking at less than the standard 6 degrees of separation between any 2 individuals. So there hasn't really been any research of the size of this study that has the capacity to look at this issue of bereavement and contagion in Northern Ireland. Okay, so Just to give you a brief overview of what we did in our study and the process we followed, we gained permission to look at the coroner's records for 403 suicides that occurred between 2007 and 2009. And that's actually not a sample, it's all of the confirmed suicides that occurred. And we matched these to GP records for two reasons really, so that we could see what level of engagement people had with services before they died, but also because the GP records have notes on social and psychological factors that these people were experiencing before they died. And the third phase of our study, then, we contacted the next of kin of those who had died through getting that information through the coroner's records, and we asked them to take part in a face-to-face interview. And 78 people agreed to meet with us. Okay, so firstly, some of the findings on those who died. For 61 out of the 403 cases that we looked at, we were able to identify a bereavement issue prior to death. And in 27, we were able to make a direct link with suicide that had occurred in this person's life prior to them taking their own life. So that constitutes firm evidence of the contagion effect in Northern Ireland, and essentially affects around 7% of suicides. And if anything, that's likely to be an underestimation because our sources of data are not perfect. You know, we've probably missed some. But one of the difficulties, as I said, there are methodological difficulties with researching suicide, the main one being that the subject from whom you wish to collect data is no longer able to give you that data. So it can be hard to get appropriate information. However, the impact within the social circumstances on families and the wider community can be assessed, and that was our aim of talking to the bereaved. So this slide describes the group of people that we spoke to, and it's just worth noting the gender imbalance here, which in a sense is to be expected given that suicide occurs more often in men. So the burden of the bereavement falls a little heavier on women, and we spoke to more women than men. But just so it's not defined, but others relates to nieces, nephews, sort of second degree relatives, if you like. And the characteristics on the right really are just there to illustrate that this was a wide range of people across all socioeconomic groups that we spoke to. Okay, as part of our interview, we administered a standard measure of psychological distress to these folk who agreed to meet us, called the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale. So that produces a score, and what this graph shows is a frequency distribution of the scores from those who filled it in. Now, the recommended cutoff value to indicate moderate or severe psychological distress is 10, and in our sample, the average was 12. So if you take this and make a comparison between the general population, what you might expect to see, and the group of people that we spoke to, the contrast is really quite stark. Nearly half of those that we interviewed were experiencing moderate to severe psychological distress in the form of anxiety and depression. And just to note, it's not on the slide, but we also found that approximately half of those we spoke to were on the psychotropic medicines that fall into the categories that Aideen described, so antidepressants and diazepam, that sort of thing. We also asked the individuals who were interviewed to tell us, did you or anyone else in your family become suicidal after this death? Now, not all of the participants were asked this question, but out of 62 that we asked, more than 4 in 10 of them said yes, this occurred. So just to sum up my section before I pass you over to Sharon, we've selected this quote from one of the interviews, and I'll just give you a chance to read through it. And the reason we put this up and the point we're trying to make here is that, you know, people recognise that there's a risk when they're going through this complex bereavement after suicide, but I think part of the problem is they're not quite sure what to do about it. So I'll pass you over to Sharon, who will look at the data that we gathered from families.
Okay, so Karen has told you about the impact on the individuals who died and the families who left behind. Now I want to talk about the impact on the wider community. This is something that's been interesting me pretty much since I started doing suicide research a number of years ago. And when I joined the Understanding Suicide team, I thought it was a great opportunity for us to find out a little bit more. It's kind of an odd thing to do, to ask people how many people might have been affected by the death of their relative. So we did it at the end of the interview after we built up a bit of a rapport with them. And we used a standard pro forma, which is based on the categories that you can see there. On average, we estimate that 71 people were affected by each death, and in the categories that you can see, so it varied quite a lot. There are two caveats with this. We didn't ask people to specify that they were badly affected. It was basically just how many people do you think were touched by this death? And the other caveat is that it varied massively, and that's a kind of interesting thing that we think needs looking at further. So, for example, in one case it was 4, and in another case it was hundreds. The qualitative data here adds context in that they often specified that a cousin or a neighbour or a friend had been particularly badly affected, and that's interesting because they wouldn't necessarily be picked up by the current approach to providing support to people. And in the policy briefing, we have a composite case of a man called William. And that was the thing that I found really interesting, because he was a business leader and he was involved in various community groups. And his brother described how everybody in the community was very shocked that if a man of his stature could do this, it could really happen to anybody. And I suppose the other point from that is it wasn't always young people. Sometimes we focus really on young people and the impact of those deaths. And actually there were some kind of middle-aged men whose deaths had a very bad impact on the community. But we've talked so far about impact on the devastating impact that this has on families, and really what Karen and I wanted to do was to provide some more information on responses and resilience of families. So we changed the focus now to look at how families responded in their help-seeking behaviour. And we want to cautiously raise awareness of the resilience of families in responding to these deaths. So these are some headline figures from a report that will be published later in the year. But we find that 39% of people undertook no formal help seeking and relied upon their family and friends, while 51% had a belief in a spiritual power that helped them cope. I thought that was quite a low figure, and it's worth pointing out here that a spiritual power was not necessarily God. It could be a range of, we had people describe as how angel cards had helped them, so it's not necessarily a religious belief. 61% of our sample did seek help in relation to the bereavement, and we've divided there who they sought help from. So we have 17% attended only the GP, 19% attended only community organisations, while 25% attended both. And I think that's really important in terms of providing services to people. They will go down a variety of routes. Also, it's worth pointing out that the GP was sometimes a very tricky person for them to seek help from, because perhaps their relative had been involved and they felt their relative had been let down by the GP or certainly the biomedical model. So in terms of provision of services, we have a quote here from a brother of a man who died, and he, like 17% of people, attended only the GP, and there are two things in this quote that I want to draw your attention to. The first is the issue of entitlement, and he talks here about having to pluck up the courage to go to the GP. There was a sense that unless you were very, very close to the individual who died, that maybe you shouldn't seek help or you weren't entitled to. The other thing is here that he did go to the GP, and this was a professional man who was reasonably well spoken and quite confident. But he had a plan that he didn't want just antidepressants, and in the end that's what he was offered, and he had to fight with the GP that he actually wanted some counselling. He wanted to go down the therapeutic route. He's kind of unusual in that a lot of people we spoke to wouldn't have necessarily had the confidence to make that decision. So in terms of provisions of services, we've previously mentioned about levels of depression and anxiety, and I wanted to draw your attention to another commonly mentioned problem, which was sleeping disturbance. This is the brother of a young man who died, and he's describing his mother who sought help from a community organisation, and she was given massage therapy for sleeping, and it really helped her. The other point from this quote is that she went on outings with people who'd been similarly bereaved. Now, she didn't necessarily go to a support group. It wasn't necessarily the type to sit around and talk about the death, but it was to talk about the issues in more general terms as part of an outing, and she found great comfort from that. And that's kind of backed up in the literature wider, that socially people like to know other people who've been bereaved in a similar way. It's very supportive. But this is where the findings become a little bit more controversial, and it is worth pointing out that we spoke to 78 people. So a great deal of support in the literature for support groups. Certainly I've read a lot about it, but there is some criticism about the way that they're recruited, and that sometimes on studies of people bereaved by suicide, they're actually recruited from support groups or from support organisations. And in our case, we had no problems in terms of recruitment because we had the addresses from the coroner, and we found actually there was a high degree of resistance among some people to support organisations in a group setting. There seem to be two factors to this. One is the close-knit nature of communities and an inability to be honest, and this was a particular feature among wives who didn't want to go to a support group because sometimes they didn't want details of what had happened to their husband to be released, and it didn't matter. So this woman in the first quote is talking about she talked to somebody one-to-one but not in a group. The other issue, and this kind of goes against a previous study in Northern Ireland about different stages of grief in the same support group, we actually found that wasn't necessarily beneficial, and sometimes it scared people because if there were people there who'd been bereaved 3 years ago, they were worried about not making progress, or in this case they felt they couldn't talk because there were people there who were more vulnerable. This slide for me is about empowerment. In the quote Karen read out earlier, we talked about fear among families, about the heightened risk. And it's something that has always really worried me, this idea that suicide runs in families. We have further details in the policy briefing about the composite case, but really I wanted to raise awareness here. There's very little point in telling people they're at increased risk of suicide unless you tell them what to do about it. And in this quote, we see that education was important for this sister whose brother had died, and she talks about encouraging people to seek some kind of help and presenting them with the options. And this was very important, empowering them and educating people about the risk of suicide while simultaneously saying, here's where you should go if you feel that somebody is at risk. As we indicated earlier, 42% of people reported that they or someone they knew became suicidal, and in this quote we have a direct response to that from a wife, and she talks about having suicidal thoughts whenever her husband took his own life. She's talking here about a phone call that he made to her that she did not pick up and how she feels guilty, and actually she talks in her interview about feeling that she was blamed by the family. But there is some evidence in the literature now that talks about post-traumatic growth in this group, so that people who are bereaved by suicide might actually experience some positive long-term aspects in some instances. I would be very cautious about that, but I am quite optimistic about the idea of suicide resistance, which is also emerging, which is that people who are exposed to a bereavement by suicide can actually go through a process of thinking about suicide as an option and reject it if they're properly supported. So it's the idea that suicide contagion is not necessarily inevitable. So time prevents us from presenting further qualitative data, but I wanted to sum up our recommendations for support, and it comes down to two things. We really need to tell people where they should go. Sometimes they said they were offered help too early, and by the time they felt they needed it, they had forgotten the details. They didn't exclusively want bereavement by suicide support necessarily. Some families did feel the stigma of suicide and wanted to just go to a general bereavement service. We need education on how an individual identifies their own need when they need to go. There was considerable confusion about when it was okay to seek help or when it was needed. And the second point is to help people understand about suicide. 39% of people were supported by their family, but it's worth pointing out this was a really tricky area, and some families broke down because of issues of guilt and blame. And we really think that that should be supported, but we also think that there should be more open and informed discussion within the community about what causes suicide, because there is a heightened awareness of it. So in conclusion, we have some summary and recommendations where we think that there is evidence of suicide transmission among those who died and those bereaved by suicide. We believe that the issue of bereavement needs to be given further prominence, therefore, within the policy, and maybe perhaps even as a distinct postvention policy. We need an acknowledgement of the broader community impact and the rapid rise in suicide. It's arguably no longer the taboo topic it was when people are talking about it. And we need access to support services regardless of kinship, so not necessarily those just in the immediate family. But as the time of austerity, we really need to think about how we can use research evidence from other countries that could be developed here, but we do feel that that should be undertaken with close evaluation because there are specific contextual issues to Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.